June 6 is Australia's National Fossil Day, and to learn about why we chose that date, please check out our earlier video here. For this year's National Fossil Day, I thought we'd check out the amazing revelation of an incredible species that can still be found in Australia today. Despite so many people trying to highlight this species over the years, for decades it remained scientifically undescribed. This odd quirk was highlighted in an 1870 letter from Alex M. Thompson, Professor of Geology at Sydney University, to the world-renowned anatomist and paleontologist at the time, Sir Richard Owen, at the British Museum. He wrote, "Considering that the fish is not uncommon and has for some years been used as an article of food, it is surprising that it had not fallen into scientific hands much earlier." What possible prehistoric species was being eaten in Australia, but no one had actually studied yet? Well, today, very few people have heard of the man who described the Australian lungfish, but the fish he named is a rock star in the world of natural history. Lungfish fossils are predominantly displayed in museums all over the world, and their living relatives can be seen swimming in many aquariums. On the 5th of February 2017, while I was working at the Chicago Field Museum, the Chicago's Shed Aquarium announced they had finally had to euthanize the lungfish which they had been displaying there since 1933. And we will get back to the fish called Grandad at the end of this video. On the 18th of January 1870, the Sydney Morning Herald carried a story that would rock the world of natural history. Time and again, the Australian continent has revealed living fossils somewhere in its sunburnt landscape. A living fossil is something that was known in the fossil record and would later be found still living somewhere out in the world. And Australia seems to have a lot of these animals. This small article was penned by the head of the Australian Museum, Gerard Krefft, and it explained Australia had just done it once more. To the editor of the Herald, "Sir, one of the most important discoveries in natural history has lately been made by the Minister of Lands, the Honourable William Forster, MLA, in the shape of an amphibious creature inhabiting northern streams and lagoons, the teeth or dental plates of which resemble some fossil fish teeth from the Liassic period." Krefft then went to point out, "It is in Australia in particular where zoological questions of great importance will be yet solved. Mr. Forster's great amphibian has enabled me to correct some misconceptions with regard to the true character of the genus Ceratodus, supposed to be a group of fossil sharks allied to our Port Jackson species. Agassiz described 24 kinds of these fishes, and Owen classified them with, and I do apologise this, I am going to get this wrong, the Cerastra Ciontidae. But the fact is, the new tooth plates figured by the two great anatomists were born of gigantic newts, or tritons, more frogs than fishes, and animals which certainly did not belong to the shark tribe, and representatives of which are still living in Queensland rivers and freshwater lagoons. Mr. Forster's amphibian is a horny-toothed Ceratodus, allied to the Lepidosirens of the Amazon and the Gambia, and probably able to make extensive journeys from pool to pool as the water dries up, or to exist for months in hard-baked clay. In honour of the gentleman who presented this valuable specimen to the museum, and in justice to him whose observation I questioned when the subject was mentioned years ago and to whom I now apologise, I name this strange animal Ceratodus forsteri." Krefft then explained what this new animal looked like. Fancy a newt 3 feet in length, covered with huge scales, with 4 scaly flappers or fins instead of legs, with 4 plates of horny teeth, 2 in each jaw, which resemble segments of a cogwheel in a horizontal position, with a tail like a siluroid or catfish, with small eyes and a partly cartilaginous skeleton. And the modern Ceratodus is complete. There are 2 flat incisor teeth in the upper jaw, resembling the 3rd incisor of a 2-year-old kangaroo. The lower jaw is destitute of incisors. Who was this scientist? And what was this fish? Well, born in 1830 in the Duchy of Brunswick, Johann Ludwig Gerard Krefft was a naturalist who migrated to Victoria from the US during the state's gold rush. Instead of finding a fortune, the naturalist ended up joining the William Blandowski's expedition along the Murray and Darling rivers. Krefft proved a natural and amassed an enormous specimen collection, which was donated to the Melbourne Museum. The institution hired Krefft to catalogue these items, and later Krefft moved to Sydney, where he was first appointed as assistant, then later became the curator of the Australian Museum. Determined to make the museum a world-class institution, not only did Krefft begin corresponding with most of the world's leading scientists, such as Darwin, Owen and Agassiz, he searched for and collected a large quantity of Australian specimens for what would become the country's National Natural History Institution. He was so diligent in his search, he spent time collecting a diprotodon fossil from Queensland while he was on his honeymoon, and in 1866 he visited the Wellington Caves. Here he dug up various fossils of some of the most iconic prehistoric Australian species known today. Though it was Krefft who would describe numerous Australian species, it was his work on this enigmatic Queensland fish that he'd be eternally connected to. Such a remarkable fish deserves an equally remarkable origin, and the Australian lungfish is up to the challenge. This would not be discovered by some mosquito-bitten expedition into the wilds of the unknown. No, this is a truly Australian fish found in a truly Australian way. Over the years, there have been various myths grow up around the discovery of this fish, with most suggesting the fish was well known to the European colonists who first settled central Queensland. One story suggests William Forster, an Australian politician who'd represented Queanbeyan before being elected as the Premier of New South Wales, had begun as a squatter in the north of the country, around the Burnett River. Here, he'd recognised the importance of a strange, delicious fish called the Burnett salmon being collected from the nearby waterways. When the fish was shown to local Indigenous groups, they recognised it as a species they called the barramundi. Now, another version of the story claims it was not Forster, but a naturalist's cousin, William McCord, of Columbia Station, who pestered Forster and anyone who would listen about the remarkable fish living in his nearby rivers. Either way, for years, Krefft had been ignoring any correspondence about investigating this species. And in a fit of despair, or maybe it was out of spitefulness, Forster one night invited the head of the museum to dinner. When their meal was served, can you guess what lay on the plate before the head of the Australian Museum? As one of Australia's most important paleontologists and naturalists, Krefft immediately recognised the importance of the fish on his plate. He would eventually name the fish Ceratodus forsteri, both attaching it to the fossil species and the man who'd literally served this fish up to him on a dinner plate. If this version of the story is the one to be believed, of course. I would just like to say, I believe it to be true, because if we go back to that original description that Krefft wrote about naming the fish, he very specifically said about Forster, whose observation I questioned when the subject was mentioned years ago, and to whom I now apologise. So there was clearly some long history here between Krefft, Forster and the fish. In 1870, lungfish were nothing new to science. Since early in the 19th century, elongated, ear-like fish with pairs of lungs and no functioning gills had been found living in Africa and South America. But in most aspects, these unusual fish were similar to most other types of modern species. What had been presented to Krefft on his dinner plate was something different. To begin with, this new fish had only one lung and gills that still allowed it to breathe in water. Also, the Queensland species had teeth identical to fossils found in most ancient geological formations all across the world. Now, the group was originally named by Louis Agassiz in 1838. The Swiss-American naturalist had described these weird Sydney Opera House-like fossil teeth as belonging to a shark, and he named the group Ceratodus, the horned teeth. Soon, fossil species were being described across the globe, many by the most famous paleontologists of the day. Names like Marsh and Cope, and even recently by Kirkland and Ostrom, were unearthing and naming species of the supposedly extinct fish. Because there was such an international interest in the fish, one of the lasting influences of Krefft was his determination to keep the discovery and description of this animal an Australian affair. For too long, Australian scientists had considered themselves inferior to the more established centres of learning in Europe, and had deferred and sent all their discoveries to the motherland for storage and describing. This practice still has ramifications, even today, with many of the country's most important specimens held in overseas institutions. Even the greatest fossil ever discovered here, the marine reptile Kronosaurus queenslandicus, is displayed at the Harvard Museum. And boy howdy, did I get into a lot of trouble one day with the ABC when I jokingly mentioned maybe we should ask Harvard for that specimen back. Now, it's not like the Australians didn't get some help with this fish either. Specimens were sent back to England for inspection by Richard Owen, who in 1839 had scientifically described another living relative, the West African lungfish, making Owen one of the few naturalists in the world with first-hand experience dealing with both species. In 1876, Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, wrote on a pair of the fish he'd received. The first was kindly placed at my disposal by the Secretary of the Society some time ago, but I was unwilling to dissect it until I had a second. This was supplied by my friend Sir John Macleay, who, on a recent visit to Australia, was kind enough to obtain a Ceratodus for me, and fulfilled his promise by sending me a very fine and well-preserved fish, rather larger than the first. With people starting to collect these fish, it first led to the belief they were intermediate between fish and lizards. Then later it was thought they were actually amphibians, perhaps like a giant newt. It was the 1870 letter, however, from Krefft that explained his reasoning behind why he was calling it an amphibian, principally because it is in the habit of leaving the water during the night. This highlights a danger in natural history writing. Using words with double meanings can have disastrous implications. Krefft used the word to describe a creature that lives both on land and water, the way we might describe a vehicle as amphibious. But of course, the word is also a class of vertebrates, and so using it in the first instance can clearly cause some confusion. It was Huxley, however, who first noted the similarities between the Australian fish and those that were still living in Africa and South America, and he was the one who tied the entire group to a Gondwana diversification. Huxley and then paleontologists like E.D. Cope then noticed that the lungfish were also closely allied with another fish species that had been described many times in the fossil record, the coelacanths. Little did these scientists know that hidden in the oceans off Indonesia and South Africa were living coelacanths. Later it became clear that the Queensland species was closely related to the older Ceratodus fossils, but enough time had passed for new features to have evolved, so their name was modified to Neoceratodus or New Ceratodus. Though it is similar to other surviving lungfish species, and even the coelacanth, Queensland's lungfish is quite possibly the most primitive of the group, hardly changing at all in the last 100 million years or so. It is a true living fossil. Now, getting back to Grandpa, in 2023 an article was published about this fish that had been on display in the Chicago Aquarium. Now, since these fish were first described in 1870, there has always been the suggestion they were very long-lived, and that is one reason why they can survive. That they can shut themselves down, bury themselves in mud quite deep during drought seasons, waiting for the floodwaters to return. Well, the authors of this paper thought, well, let's see if this is true, and they sourced DNA from Grandad, the Chicago lungfish, after it had been put down. And they utilised an epigenetic aging clock. Records show this lungfish from Australia was donated to the Chicago John J. Shedd Aquarium around 1933, and it lived there for 84 years until its death in 2017. Thanks to their test, however, they estimated Grandad had been 109 years old. Genotyping also revealed the origin of Grandad to be the Burnett River in Queensland, Australia, the location of that very original discovery in 1870. So there you go, the fish that came to dinner. I hope it's true. I certainly hope that Krefft was actually given the very first specimen to be described on his dinner plate. Australia is a weird place, and Australians have a weird sense of humour, and that just tickles me pink. Alright, so thank you very much. That's National Fossil Day 2024 wrapped up. Make sure you visit your local museums, make sure you check out the channel for more videos, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.